called double depression. So you're always low-grade depressed, and then every few months you spiral into a really deep depression. If you've had a major depression in your life, what are the odds that you'll have another at some point? Way over 50%. What if you've had two? What are the odds you'll have a third? Over 75%. Three and more, 90%. Depression, some people get depressed after a major loss. They're really depressed for 6 months. They bounce back and are never depressed again. But that's rare. Depression tends to be a recurrent, cyclic, episodic mental illness. There's something about maybe even having your first depression that resets your brain, so to speak, so that you're more likely to experience those symptoms again after another loss. How frequently does depression exist in childhood? It's pretty rare. Way rarer than ADHD. Maybe 1 to 2% of kids. But by the time age 11 or 12 roll around, and between 11 and 12 and 17 or 18, now 1 in 5 girls will have a major depression, and almost 1 in 10 boys. So adolescence is the time when depressions spike up. What goes along with depressions? Depression and anxiety frequently coexist. You're worried about everything. You're depressed and you're unmotivated, and what am I going to do on the next test, and what if somebody asks me out, and how do I deal with my parents, and I'll never finish school, and I can't pay the rent. Everything multiplies. Surprisingly, about a third of teens with depression meet criteria for conduct disorder, aggression and acting out. Now that's kind of the classic internalizing and the classic externalizing. A fancy term for this from the book is that's heterotypic comorbidity. Because it's a comorbid, you could think why anxiety and depression would go together, or why conduct disorder and ADHD would go together. But why would depression and conduct disorder go together? Internalizing, externalizing coming together, heterotypic comorbidity, not a term we're going to emphasize. Lots of interesting theories about how that might occur. ADHD, a history of ADHD and school failure can lead to depression. People who have learning problems and no one ever got it, they just think the kid's stupid, may develop depression. We're going to talk about this right after spring break. The suicide rate, which in young people had been steadily declining for a few years, is now back up, and especially in girls. So we're going to ask why. If you go county by county in the United States and you count the number of SSRIs that are prescribed, the counties that prescribe more have lower suicide rates. Medications can help treat depression and suicide, but they're not a cure. Again, we'll talk about this right after spring break, but what is it about girls at age 11, 12, 13? Is it the pubertal hormones? Is it that girls have to do everything kind of perfectly and boys have kind of an easier break that way? Ruminative style? We all do this occasionally. God damn, I had that interview and I should have said this. Oh, in the intramural game, if only I'd been alert and run through the whole pattern, I would have caught the pass. But what if you ruminate every day about everything you've done? You can't shut off the loop. This is a risk factor for later depression. Girls are particularly likely to ruminate. Can't let it go. Keep going over and over it. And as you might guess, that's going to fuel depressive mood. What's the heritability of depression? It's lower than you might think. It's about 29% in men and about 39% in women. What's heritability? You've all memorized this now. It's not whether your or my depression is more genetic or environmental. It's why across the population, people tend to get depressed or not, how much do genes play a role? Genes play under a third of the role in men for depression risk and about 40% for women. So first, things going on in your environment, shared or non-shared, have a lot to do with depression risk. Second, 39 to 40% in women, 29 to 30 in men, that's a 10% difference. That's a significant difference. Genetic vulnerability plays a bigger role in gals than it does in guys. But what about gene-environment interactions? From the Caspi et al. Study, it may not just be that you've got the risky allele of the serotonin transporter gene, but if you've got that risky allele and you've had a lot of loss events or maltreatment, it's the combination, right? It's the interaction. The genetic risk and the environmental risk triples your actual risk for depression. Here's another way to think about it, and this is a pretty intriguing statistic. Let's say one of your parents, not even both, one of your parents, biological parents, has had major depressions in their life. You grow up to 25. What's the risk that you'll have had a major depression? 60%. Now, genes are explaining only about a third of that. What else is it like for you growing up with a parent with a major depression? Well, if they were really depressed when you were an infant, maybe they had trouble bonding with you, and that reunion behavior of yours wasn't too secure. Or maybe if you grow up with a very depressed parent, how do they cope? By lying in bed and by saying the world's a pretty awful place. So maybe you model a kind of passive style. Or maybe you tend to believe, the way that depressed adults who happen to be your parents believe, nothing I do matters. What do depressed parents do when they're disciplining their kids? God damn it, I'm sick of this. Clean up after dinner. So you think, well, that's sort of the parent of a conduct disorder kid. If you're depressed, everything's a burden, including your kids. So depressed parents are often pretty irritable and harsh and even coercive in their discipline styles. What do you hear your parent do if you're a kid growing up in a home where your parent's depressed? Your parent blames herself or himself all the time. So maybe you model that style. So there's a lot of non-genetically mediated reasons, listed 5 here in the bullet points, why growing up in a home with a parent who's pretty severely depressed might make you liable to depression. What's going on in the brains of people with depression? Left hemisphere. The left hemisphere, when it's really cooking with gas, makes you feel positive. There's left hemispheric low brain activation. Maybe there's some pleasure, positive mood, biological risk underlying depression. The hippocampus, that part of the brain, we're not going to emphasize this at all, that consolidates short and long-term memory, the hippocampus shrinks when you have major depression. One of the effects of the SSRI medications is to keep that hippocampus volume up. Question in front. So what about a parent who was pretty depressed and has treatment? The kids do better. Treating a parent with depression may be a good preventive treatment for preventing depression in their kids later on. Right? So the kid still has whatever genetic risk, but it's the environmental change that may spur the kid to change. Question here. And in PTSD too, and is that because PTA shares symptoms with depression, or is there something unique about PTSD? Welcome to the new world of neurobiology. These are big questions. People who get depressed, not surprisingly, have a lot of bad stuff happen in their lives. So we got to look at that. Would anybody get depressed with enough bad things happening in their lives? Or are certain people more vulnerable to those negative life events? Or do certain people who tend to be depressive attract negative life events? So people who study life events and depression make an important distinction. You can categorize all the bad things that can happen to you the next year. And some of them, you didn't keep a job, that could be depressing, but maybe you were kind of depressed and the boss didn't think you're doing a good job. That might be not very independent. Or you could lose your mom and dad to illness. You probably didn't have anything to do with that unless you murdered them, right? So it'd be independent. What people try to do is count the number of negative events that could plausibly be related to your own behavior and those life events that just happen by chance. And it turns out that what? People prone to depression have both more contingent and non-contingent negative life events. They may play a role in generating negativity, but they also may be susceptible to things that were not in their control. What's going on in your mind, not so much your brain? Aaron Beck, one of the world's leaders in the study of depression, talked years ago about the negative triad. If I'm depressed, I suck, the world sucks, and the future sucks. And I'm saying this in a kind of silly way, but I don't mean it. If I'm truly not capable, and if everybody out there in the world isn't, there's not much a good future for me. No wonder suicidal thoughts are going to come to play. People who are depressed tend to do what? Did you do everything perfectly this weekend? Yeah, I won't believe if you raise your hand. But what if you focus on the one or two things that you really messed up on? You distort, you magnify, you exaggerate. Now, we talked about the hostile attribution bias for aggressive kids. The world's a pretty hostile place. Uh-oh, something bad happened. You must have caused it. I'm going after you. In depression, Beck talks about a negative attributional bias. If something bad happens, it's because of me. It's internal. It happens all the friggin' time. It's global. And it's going to keep staying negative. It's stable. So you get a crappy score on a test. I had a bad day. It won't happen again. I'm usually not that way. So I was external, unglobal, and unstable. I'll probably bounce back. But if I'm stupid, and if Berkeley professors are out to get me, and if I'm always going to be behind the 8 ball, how are you going to do? That's a depressive set of attributions. Everybody's self-esteem fluctuates. You hit the final 4, your bracket's good, you feel better for a day or two, you miss it, you feel bad for a half a minute. But what if your self-esteem is always contingent on what's happening outside? You don't have a stable self-esteem, you're going to be prone to depression. And I'm re-emphasizing rumination, especially salient in teenage girls, but can certainly go beyond the teenage years, the chronic rehashing of all the negative events that happen. Big question for depression. So, are more kids and teens getting depressed than 50 years ago? Some people say absolutely, some people aren't so sure, but we do know this. When I was a grad student at UCLA a long time ago, I remembered in a class that I took my first year of grad school, what's the average age at which a woman gets depressed? 35. What's the average age today at which a woman who's vulnerable to depression gets depressed? About 22. Things are happening earlier in depression. So if the average age is 22, 23, there's a lot of gals who are getting depressed at 14, 15, 16, 17, bringing that mean age lower. What is it about? Are genes mutating fast? No. What is it about the culture that might be causing depression ever earlier? And stay tuned right after spring break. You are running a clinic, and an 11-year-old comes in, and he is super depressed. He's in 7th grade, and he feels that nothing he does in school is right, and he's dropped off of all sports teams. The parents suspect he started to get high on marijuana, maybe sneaking drinks, and during the interview, the kid says, my family would be better off without me. My life is going nowhere, and the kid has not smiled. Now, that kid's got a major depression. You can document that for more than 2 weeks. Will that kid go on to have more depressions? Or in 6 months or a year, will that kid develop a mania? Will that kid now start to show bipolar disorder? How can you tell if he hasn't shown it? Stay tuned. We'll talk about this. Because if you're a clinician working in a community mental health center, this is a big issue for you. Because if he really does have bipolar disorder, what are the odds he will try to kill himself over the next 10 years? About 50%. Bipolar disorder has a huge risk for suicide, even more than depression. If you take medications for depression, like SSRIs, what happens if you're 8 years old or 11 or 15? For the first 8 weeks or so, you start to think about suicide. Why? Because the SSRIs reduce your inhibitions. The SSRIs make it, you're not kind of shut down. Paradoxically, in the first few weeks to months of treatment with medications for depression, you may get more suicidal ideas or more ideas about aggression than if you'd never treated the kid. But what happens if you stay with that medication and the doctor's really diligent and you're getting talk therapy too and you're at the right dose? Eventually, the kid's depression will get better and won't be thinking about suicide as much. So this is one of the paradoxes, that one of the most effective treatments for depression, especially for adults, the SSRIs are helpful for kids, but not dramatically helpful. But when they're helpful, you've got to go through a difficult period at the beginning where the medications seem to be going in the opposite direction. This is why the drug companies got in trouble 10 years ago. The drug companies were starting to give SSRIs to teens. And they found these data, that 8% of teens taking the medications voice suicidal thoughts versus only 3% on placebo. And what did the drug companies do? They buried the data. They didn't publish it. They thought it would cut down sales. And then when Congress finally unearthed this, this is why pharma gets itself in trouble. Because to boost sales, they may not publish the things that consumers need to know. How do you treat depression? Cognitive behavioral therapy is a big evidence-based treatment. The therapist isn't going to sit there and just listen to your dreams. The therapist is going to do what? Challenge your thinking strategies. Oh yeah, is it really true that this always happens this way when you start to feel this way? And you do homework at home, and you try out different thinking strategies and rate your mood. What if you're in such a major depression that you're not getting out of bed? All the thinking changes in the world aren't going to help. The therapist motivates you to get out of bed, and even though you feel almost literally like death, you go bowling, you go to class. If you do this for a couple of days going through the motions, your mood starts to lift. The mood will follow the activation. There's another interesting form of therapy for depression called interpersonal therapy. And this has its origins in some psychoanalytic therapies where you talk about problems, but it's really talking about the relationship you have with your mom and dad, with your boyfriend or girlfriend, with your teachers, and you try to problem solve around how to improve those relationships. Do medications work for child and adolescent depression? The old school antidepressants, the tricyclic antidepressants, don't work at all. The SSRIs work, but what did we just say? Number one, the first few weeks are tough. And second, what if you're a teen who's had a serious depression and we put you on placebo? What are the chances you'll be better in 6 months? About 40%. Why? Depression is a recurrent illness. If we put you on an SSRI, what are the odds you'll get better? About 50 to 55%. 55% is better than 40%, but it's not a whole lot better. Remember with ADHD medications and stimulants, what percentage of kids with ADHD do better on stimulants? 80%, and what's the placebo rate? 12%. That's a big gap. For SSRIs, 55% versus 40%, it's helpful on average, but medicines are not the full answer. What works best for depression with teens or adults? combining, this is the TAD study, you don't need to know what the treatment of adolescent depression study, combining well-delivered SSRIs with well-delivered cognitive behavioral therapy. Because now your serotonin system is more finely tuned, and you're getting some help around challenging your thoughts and emotions and lifting yourself out of depression. What's the real goal? If I get depressed today, what are the odds I'll have another depression next few years? Remember, at least 50%. Can the medicines I take now, even if I go off them, or can the therapy I get now help me cope with and prevent my next depression 5 years later? Or is it just like, oh no, woe is me, it's another depression, nothing works? What we'd really like to do is give the person coping strategies to deal with the depression next time it happens. Nothing yet has been found to be that level of prevention. Questions on depression? Tough topic. Yes? Medication rate of success is 55%, placebo is 40%. So it's 15% better on medication. It's a significant difference, but it's not a whopping difference. We need to add therapies to medication. Next time, bipolar disorder. Stay tuned.